Hjertelig velkommen alle sammen til Fritt Ord og dette seminaret om journalistikkens status i Norge og 35 andre land. Jeg heter Grete Brochmann og jeg er styreleder i Fritt Ord. This event takes place in partnership with the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, and Nic Newman is here to present the international report, and a special welcome to you. The Fritt Ord Foundation has a highly appreciated and long-term cooperation with the Reuters Institute. We are co-funding some of its research, and we have established a scholarship program in which Norwegian journalists and editors can spend half a year in Oxford in order to work on a specific project, profiting from the excellent academic environment. Nic Newman's introduction will be in English, although the main part of this seminar will be in Norwegian. Støtte til uavhengig journalistikk som spiller en rolle i samfunnet er et av de viktigste områdene som Fritt Ord jobber med. Og dette vil trolig bli enda viktigere i årene som kommer. For journalistikken befinner seg, som vi alle vet, i en spesielt krevende og utfordrende situasjon nå for tiden. Det beste av journalistikk som blir skapt i dag er trolig mer profesjonell og har også trolig høyere kvalitet enn noen gang. Men samtidig så ser vi at det i det minste foreløpig er store problemer med å finansiere den. Globale teknologiaktører som ikke produserer journalistikk selv, overtar det meste av annonseinntektene, og brukerbetalingen monner ikke som kompensasjon. Samtidig sliter journalistikken med borgernes lave tillit, og politiske angrep forsøker tidvis også å svekke pressens renommé ytterligere. I denne situasjonen så trenger vi pålitelig kunnskap om journalistikkens status og brukernes forhold til den. Det gir Digital News-prosjektet fra Reuters Institute oss konkrete fakta og innsikter som vi kan sammenligne nå på tvers av 36 land. En bevilgning fra Fritt Ord gjorde at Norge i fjor for første gang kunne inkluderes i rapporten, og i år så har vi i tillegg bedt medieforskere ved Universitetet i Bergen lage en liten analyse av de norske resultatene på norsk. Alt dette skal vi nå få høre mer om, og også kunne diskutere i de følgende 2 timene. Så hjertelig velkommen igjen til dere alle, og jeg gir ordet til kveldens ordstyrer, Kjersti Løken Stavrum, som nå er direktør i stiftelsen T-News, men tidligere var generalsekretær i Norges Pressforbund. Vær så god.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome to everyone. I will hand the microphone directly over to Nic Newman. He has, as all interesting people, a background as journalist, and has also a long career by forming the BBC's digital services for more than a decade, and he's also the lead author of this report. So please welcome Nic Newman.
Thank you very much. Really good to be here again. We were here in August of the 2016 one to share the global findings for 2017, but also to nurture what's a very valuable relationship for us too with Fritt Ord, and also with the University of Bergen, who've done the local report, one of I think 12 local reports around the world where academics and others have helped shape what we do. So I think it's really enriched the report to have such really strong local partners for this year's report. So as you know, this is the biggest ongoing survey of news in the world now. So 70,000 people were surveyed in 36 countries and 5 continents. We've added countries in Latin America, also in Asia, which I think is really helpful to understand where Norway or Europe sits, and to have really interesting other comparators rather than just thinking about Europe or about our own countries. I should say, as I do every year, this is an online poll, so it is therefore representative of those who are online, not necessarily national populations. and as such it will tend to slightly underrepresent traditional news users when we're talking about TV, radio and print. The polling was conducted by YouGov on our behalf, and you can see there the samples in each country, around 2,000, including Norway. So on to just some key findings. I'm just going to pull out really 4 key themes that I know are going to sort of stimulate some of the debate later. There's a lot in the report, so do, and in the Norwegian version, so do dig down more deeply. So firstly, trust in the news media and in social media we find is low in almost all countries, and we were really interested to find out some of the reasons why. It's not just partisanship, but I'm going to talk about that a little today. There's the question of whether fake news and low quality news is making journalism more or less valuable. And what we find this year is that in the States we've seen it becoming more valuable again. Maybe that's just temporary, not elsewhere so far. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is a really interesting shift towards the use of messaging apps, away perhaps from open social networks. Maybe we're seeing a change within social media. And then maybe slightly counterintuitively, far from sort of echo chambers, which is the sort of the current narrative, social and search we find is exposing people to more sources of news, but there are some downsides and some problems of brand recognition in those distributed environments. So I'm going to focus on those things. So firstly, starting with the so-called fake news debate, and we find generally very low trust in almost all countries we looked at this in around social media. Just 24% saying it does a good job in separating fact from fiction. And these are just some of the comments from respondents on the issue. So it's a petri dish for ideological fake news was one of the comments. Others people talk about feeds being polluted in a way by hyper-partisan news or extreme content. People share without reading information in the articles. This is a very frequent complaint, increasingly frequent complaint that we picked up in the qualitative comments. On the other hand, there are 24%, there are some people, almost a quarter, who think social media does do a good job in separating fact from fiction. And by providing for them more authentic news, perspectives that you won't get on mainstream media, so a wider variety of news. So this is not a universal story. If we compare social media to mainstream media, to traditional media, with the same question, we find that about twice as many people, so 40%, think the news media does a good job in separating fact from fiction. So better, but not exactly a ringing endorsement. And for those people who think that, they say, of course, it's their job, it is the journalist's job to sift false information from correct information, to bring credible reports, and that crucially, journalism, mainstream media brings some kind of accountability. The fact that there's bylines, the fact there are verifiable processes, the fact that the reputation of a brand that has been around for a long time is at stake. People identify with those things, and I think there's a real opportunity to do more around these key factors that people trust to increase trust further. If we look more generally at the question of trust, this is the question we ask about percentage that agree that they trust the media most of the time. We see really significant variation across countries and very similar order to last year. So Finland, again, is the #1 country for trust. 62% say that they trust. Norway's high end of trust, and then at the other end you have countries like Greece and Korea, just 23%. So in those countries, the mainstream media, the traditional media, is not really credible. It's too affected by being seen as being part of too close to politics, too close to politicians or to businessmen. So trust is much lower. Another interesting finding this year is that in some countries we've seen trust decline significantly, particularly in the United Kingdom, down 7 percentage points in just 1 year since the Brexit vote. And we attribute a lot of that to the increased polarisation within the UK, and therefore the more difficult position that many media companies that try and be open and balanced in the middle, because the extremes don't believe what they say anymore. So we see a sort of significant change in the UK in just 1 year. In the United States, trust, as we know, has been particularly low for many years. It's around 38% for the general trust figure. But one of the things we found really interesting was that when you ask people about the trust in the sources they themselves use, the trust is much higher, so 53%. And so this would be sources, if you're on the right, for Fox News, or from the left, it might be the Washington Post. So this suggests to us that there was a deep polarization in the US, which maybe we didn't see in other countries. I think Hungary was the only other country that had the same levels of polarization. So one of the things we wanted to do this year was to see if it was possible to visualize what that polarization looked like. So what does a polarized media system look like? And so what we did was we asked people about what their political beliefs were. So are you left-wing, are you extreme left-wing, are you extreme right-wing, where would you sit politically? And then we looked at what they actually used, so we asked what brands they used, and then we mashed all that data together to get a picture of the American media scene. And this is essentially the picture of the American media scene. And you can see that what you have is a very, very heavy weighting to the left. So maybe Donald Trump is right. There actually is, from the perception of the American audience, there is a liberal media. And you can see the brand names there, which won't surprise you: the Washington Post, CNN, the New York Times. And on the right, you only have one brand that represents effectively half of the US population. And this big gap in the middle, Jeff Jarvis often talks about this sort of, the media has not been representing people effectively in the United States. And then, of course, on top of that, you have, you've seen the rise of these hyper-partisan sites, so like Breitbart and Occupy Democrats. And in the States, they're quite big, so reasonably sizable numbers of people are actually using those brands. But in terms of the trust, these are some of the comments that people talk to us about. So you can see most of the mistrust is coming from this side, from the right. They don't trust the media because they don't feel it fairly represents them. So Fox News keeps it fair. CNN tells us left-wing lies. They are so far to the left they might fall off. And yes, and if you look at the statistics, those on the political right, almost 3 times as likely to distrust the news media. So you ready for the Norwegian one? So how different is Norway on the same scale? So what you see is a very, very different picture. So a number of different characteristics. So firstly, the number of brands is much smaller because it's a smaller country, and those brands therefore have much bigger market share. You also don't see hyper-partisan brands, at least not with very, very high, with high levels of usage. And there is, it's a bit more in the middle. There is a bit of a gap over here. When we look at the data more carefully, so maybe there's an unrepresentative aspect here. Those on the political right are much less likely to trust the news media, so 41% to 53% in terms of trust. So potentially, given the distribution capabilities within Facebook, there is an opportunity for hyper-partisan sites on the right here or on the left. And I'll leave Hallvard to talk more about the Norwegian media scene. So one of the most interesting, and we've done that for many of the countries, and I suppose one of the other things is it just shows how different media systems are. So in many ways, America is an edge case. Many European systems look more like Norway, particularly some of the Nordic ones. So onto social media, one of the most interesting findings for me anyway is the changing shape of the social media landscape. Now on the surface, everything looks pretty similar. So on average, over half of us say we get news from social media every week. So 54% is the average across all of the countries. And you can see the growth in the UK and the US has continued for the last year. So the change is almost twice as many people are using social media for news as they were in 2013. So enormous levels of growth. However, elsewhere, in a large number of countries, in fact in more than half the countries we look at, we've seen a decline in the reported use of social media for news. So you can see that a dip in Spain, France, Germany, but also just a small decline in Norway and a slightly more significant one in Sweden. So this could be to do with the trust issues that I mentioned earlier, or it could be to do with changes in the algorithm, Facebook algorithm that were made last year that prioritised friends and family a little bit more than professional news content. Or it could be the rise of messaging apps, or it could be a mixture of all three. We don't precisely know why that's happening. If we look at the detail by network, this is the social networks on the left, and then for the first time we've sort of split out messaging applications on the right. And what this shows is the dark blue is whether you use any of these networks for any purposes. So 70% use Facebook for any purpose. I think it's about the same number in Norway. And then for news, the light number, 47%, so almost half, are using Facebook for news. And then you can see YouTube more important in some countries than others. Twitter is still as important or as unimportant as ever, 10%, depending on your view. But I think the really interesting thing is the growth in WhatsApp. So WhatsApp, not so popular here, but in some countries, very, very popular. So on average, 40% are using WhatsApp now, and 15% for news. Last year, that figure was 8% for news, so the country mix is slightly different. So really significant increases. I guess in Norway, one of the things that always surprises me is how many people use Snapchat here. So I think that you were one of the first places to have Snapchat Discover launched, non-English countries, and that's because you're using Snapchat much more heavily. So in different countries, people use different networks, but in general, the trend is towards more closed messaging. And part of that is that in some countries like Malaysia or Hong Kong or Turkey, where it can be dangerous to talk openly in open networks about political issues, for example, it's much safer to talk in closed groups. So I think that's one of the things driving it, along with bundling of free WhatsApp minutes with phone contracts in many parts of the world. So I think this is a really interesting phenomenon to watch further. However, we should remember that if you put together all of the companies that Facebook owns, so Facebook owns Instagram and also WhatsApp, so if you put all those together, then 80% of us are touching a Facebook product weekly and 54% for news. So they still have a very, very powerful position. More widely, we need to understand how Facebook and these other players, how the whole sort of distribution environment and how the discovery of news is affected. So where does social fit into that sort of world? This is a chart we've done which is based on what's your preferred way of getting to a news website or app. So do you go directly? Do you tend to search for news? Is your preference to go through social media feeds? Do you use email as your primary way, or mobile alerts? Both of these have grown significantly, by the way, in the last few years. Or are you using an aggregator? And in general, we find that only about a third of us are now using direct. So a few years ago, that would be much higher. And distributed media is now accounts for 65% of access to news websites, and for under 35, 73%. So these channels, when you put them together, are becoming much, much more important. And then if you look at ones that are decided by algorithms rather than editors, so that's search and social and some aggregators, some news aggregators use algorithms. If you put those together, it comes to just over half. So now this was a tipping point year. The majority of people are now getting their news delivered via algorithmic selection rather than journalistic selection in most countries, but not in Norway. So there are differences, significant differences between countries. So if the percentage of people who go direct in Norway is 67%, so the highest in the world, which comes back to those very strong brands that do a really good job in getting people to go back regularly directly to those brands rather than through distributed brands. Whereas in many Latin American countries, social is the starting point, and the direct brand is less important, or it has to play in those distributed environments. In search, so many Central European countries, Turkey as well, still really in the portal age, so search is much more important. And then in some other countries like Japan and Korea, you have these aggregators like Yahoo, who act in many ways like Facebook, and it's the starting point for news in those countries. So again, it speaks to the same issue that countries are different and systems are different. One other really significant issue and finding from this year's report is a surprising finding is that far from creating echo chambers, for most people, social media helps expose them to a greater number of sources and a greater variety of sources too than those who don't. So here are the statistics. This is essentially just counting the number of sources that people use. So people who use social media consume over 4 different sources every week. People who don't use social media only consume 3, and search even more so. So when you see a search results, it is exposing you, incidentally exposing you to a greater range of sources, and you click on a greater range of sources than people who don't use search regularly. So this is maybe a counter. It doesn't mean to say there's no echo chamber effect. It just means there is a positive effect, and quite often we don't talk about the positive effects of search and social media as well. On the other hand, people may be exposed to more sources, but they don't necessarily remember the news brand that they find in those distributed sources. So this was just some research we did in the UK this year, where we looked at what people were doing. So we were passively tracking people as they went around the web, and then within 24 hours we gave them a survey and said, you read this story, can you remember the name of the brand? And 81% could remember the name of the brand if they came directly from another page on the website, but only 37% could remember the brand 24 hours later when they come from search, and only 47% from social. So I think this has quite a lot of implications for the discussions that we have with platforms. It has a lot of implications for business models that are built on trying to get brand awareness, because if people aren't remembering you, that strategy is not going to be working. And we're going to be publishing more information about that study later in the year. So just finally, to the business issues. And to what extent do the worries about fake news and the low quality of news and the polarisation and all these issues I've talked about feed through to increased willingness to pay for news? So the answer is we have seen a significant change in the United States. So paying for news has risen, for any kind of online news in the last year, has risen by 7 percentage points in just 1 year, from 9% to 16%. And what's really interesting is it's being driven largely by the young, so by under 35s, 24 to 34s, and by those on the political left, probably for fairly obvious reasons. And of all of those people paying, 29% said that the reason that they did it was to help fund journalism, which is twice the percentage, more than twice the percentage that the all-country average. And here you see the figures and some of the implications of that. So New York Times has put on over 500,000 digital subscribers, Wall Street Journal over 200,000, etc. So we have seen change. Whether this is just a temporary phenomenon, we'll have to wait and see whether they can keep those subscribers. However, more generally, we don't see very much change. So the average is still around 13%, which is similar to last year. Slight increases in some countries, but broadly the same. And in terms of highs and lows, Norway is number 1 again. And I think the reasons for that are that it's most of the Nordic markets where, so the darker colouring is essentially where the percentage of people paying for news is highest, and the lighter colours are where it's least high. So highest in Norway, lowest in the UK and Greece at 6%. And I think the reason is that in Norway, obviously you're protected by language to some degree. There's a strong reading tradition, but it's also a place where the publishers here have used data and technology in a very smart way to get new subscribers and to upsell people. So I think there's a lot of innovation here. A lot of people come here looking at what the Norwegians have done and what the secrets of success are. And I think lowest in the UK and Greece because not many providers are even trying to charge people for news. So a lot of it's the supply side, a lot of it's what the publishers are doing, rather than, say, the presence of a big public broadcaster, though, of course, that plays a part. This is just a quote from somebody in the UK which talks about, there's a lot of free news around in the English-speaking world. It's really hard. But in the focus groups, even in those countries, we detected that people might be prepared to pay in the future. So I think there are definitely seeds of hope this year in a way that there weren't last year. There is potential, I think, and that a lot of that goes back to the discussion about the quality of news. And just finally, it's interesting, for the first time we looked at people who were paying for news and people who were paying for other kinds of digital content to see if there was any correlation or relationship. So this is, Netflix, TV and film subscriptions, music subscriptions, and broadly you see some connection around the 25 to 34s. So again, young people are paying not only for news, but they're paying for Spotify, they're paying for Netflix. And there's, in many ways, Netflix and Spotify have kind of conditioned people to understand how subscription works. And it's people of my generation, actually, who aren't prepared to pay for anything online, which is where a lot of the problem is, I think. So that's maybe a slightly surprising finding. This is just one person we talked to in the focus group, so unrepresentative, completely unrepresentative, but he pays for the New York Times, he gave a donation to The Guardian, he paid for something called The Intercept, and he paid for a YouTube channel called Young Turks. And it was something that he really valued and cared about. So young people do care about news. There's lots in the report, but just to recap what we've talked about here, trust is low, but the news media is still valued more than social media in separating fact from fiction. There is a significant difference in people's minds. And perhaps because of that, there is an opportunity for news organisations to build on this, to create even more valuable experiences, to differentiate itself from general news that's published anywhere, that anybody can publish, and building that habit back into digital media. Social media remains critical for news, but we are seeing significant change. We're starting to see change within the social landscape and the rise of messaging apps, and it's, I think, an important thing for publishers to think about how they're going to take account of this new trend, which is likely to continue. And then platforms play, actually, there's a positive and a negative, so they're playing a very valuable role in incidentally exposing people to news who otherwise would not go to news sites. On the other hand, there are big questions around brand recognition, around the terms of trade between publishers and platforms, which remain very difficult issues, and I'm sure we'll discuss as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just that everyone knows, we will check that you have all registered all the figures before you leave. So I think there will be lots of numbers here tonight. I think also Hallvard, that is the next in line. He will try to reduce the number of figures, isn't that so? He's professor in media science and has also worked with this report. Please, you have a few comments.
Thank you, Kjersti. I will talk English for now, and then I will switch to Norwegian by magic later on. Thank you, Nic, and thank you to the Reuters Institute for this great work, and thank you to Fritt Ord also for funding the Norwegian part of this survey. As Grete said, this is the second year that Norway has been included in this really one-of-a-kind worldwide survey of news consumption, which is a great resource not only for researchers but also for the public debate more widely. As Kjersti mentioned, I've, together with two colleagues, Hilde Zakariassen and Jan Fredrik Hovden, worked on a short report which is available for you in print, thanks to Fritt Ord, and also online from the University of Bergen website. The main point of the report is to kind of bring out the Norwegian data. And we think that's important because it's useful for debate, stuff like we have now. I think it's also useful for the media sector, and hopefully for policy making and for researchers in general. In the report, we basically try to give you the Norwegian figures, and then we systematically try to compare it with the European Union numbers, right? So the idea is to see what the status is in Norway, and then as we go through it, compare it with the countries that are pretty similar to us. What I thought I would do as a way of commenting on Nic's general introduction to the panel today, I would try to characterize the Norwegian situation in 3 points. And as I looked again at my points before this session, I realized that they perhaps seem a bit uplifting, not too bleak. It can be because I live in Bergen. We've had rain for every day, all of June, and now finally I come to summer and sun. But 3 points to try to kind of describe the Norwegian situation. One thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that we have really high penetration of new media technology in general. internet, a very basic thing, right? But it's worth remembering for the way we understand the figures here, but also for the value of the survey in itself, because due to the high internet penetration in Norway, the survey data for Norway is actually more representative for the population in general than in some of these other countries where the internet penetration is much lower. But we have a high penetration, we are early adopters, we use the smartphones a lot. 45% of us claim to have used it last week to read news in the bathroom or at the toilet, which was a surprising finding to me. And we are also, in general, more digital in our news use compared to the European Union in general. And Nic is right to point out the kind of outstanding numbers for Snapchat use in general and for news use in Norway. And I would invite the people from the media in the panel to try to explain that to me, because I don't have a good answer either. So that's the first kind of point, high penetration that we need to keep in mind. The second point is that throughout the report, I think, the established news providers remain strong. That's kind of a main finding to me. And there are several reasons why I will claim that. And the first thing is, and Nic has mentioned some of these, the first thing is that the brands we use when we consume news are, to a very large extent, still legacy media, including broadcasters. So that means media owners, media titles, brands that was established in the analog era, either as newspapers or as radio and television channels, and has kind of merged into the digital area. There's less focus and less attention from consumers towards digital-born brands. So that would be media that have been born after the internet became a mainstream media platform. And that's one way that Norway kind of stands out in this comparison. The second point has to do with the way we find the news online. Nic already mentioned this. We go directly to the websites of the news providers to a much larger extent than the average in the EU, and also the average across all these countries. And that's important, of course, because it means that people come to your brand, right? You come to your website, and the potential for keeping people and the users within your sphere is bigger than when the users come to your website through Googling or through social media. It's also worth underlining that although a lot of Norwegians use social media to get news, social media is not the main news source for many Norwegians. So again, we use social media, but rather than having that as the main source, it's the established brands that stands out in this material. We do also have relatively high levels of trust in the news in general. And we do find a little bit less trust in the news in general among those people who say they vote to the right, which is in line with what previous studies have found. But by comparison to other countries, the levels are pretty okay, and I would say. And we do not, as Nic underlined, we do not see a huge divide between people's trust in news in general and people's trust in the news they use, right? So you would perhaps think that people could dislike or have distrust in the news in general, but feel really good about the news providers that they've chosen to use, that they have a kind of established relationship to. We don't find a huge separation there. And as Nic explained, a huge separation between those two figures could signal a huge polarization in the political environment. And finally, a final point to kind of underline that the established news providers remain strong in Norway. That has to do, of course, with the willingness to pay for news. And it's good to be on top of the list, I guess, for news providers in Norway. It's worth underlining the success, I guess, of the hybrid subscriptions. So the fact that people say that they pay for online news because they paid for a combination of print and digital subscription. But it's also worth looking at what people say that they are interested in paying for when it comes to news, right? What kind of news stories are they interested in paying for? And on that data, people underlined investigative journalism, but also access to news archives online as two key points that they are interested in actually paying for, which again would be a plus, I guess, for established brands and the editorial news providers. So that was my second key, main point about the established news providers. And finally then, I would like to underline that Norwegians do have a high interest in the news. Not surprisingly, very few claim to be not interested in the news. Many more do, from time to time, avoid the news, but the numbers are quite low comparatively, and they kind of confirm the image we have of news consumption in Norway. Those who do express a low interest in the news, however, are more likely to be female, more likely to have a low income, and they are more digital in their general media consumption compared to the rest. So, to sum up, before I leave the floor to the panel, comparatively speaking, I think Norwegian media is in a good position to make it. And they should be happy about their consumers. So that was my uplifting